In just 3 years, 19 innocent people lost their lives. After being murdered, they were treated with unspeakable cruelty. The perpetrators' methods were enough to make anyone shudder. What could twist someone's soul into something so terrifying? Let's join crime documentary files as we explore today's case. The main figure in this case is Yang Tianyong, born in 1959 in Chuxiang, Yunnan, China. From childhood, he was known as a problematic kid, lazy in his studies but fond of mischief and destruction. However, nature had blessed him with a strong, robust physique. Seeing their son's lack of interest in studying, his family decided that when he grew up, it would be best to send him into the military. This was perhaps a logical decision at the time, because in that era, joining the military wasn't just an honor, but also a guarantee for the future. After discharge, soldiers would be assigned stable government jobs. So when he came of age, Tianyong enlisted. After his military service, Tianyong was assigned to work at the Kunming Railway Bureau, becoming a police officer at the East Station Police Department. For a young man from a poor rural background, becoming a city police officer was indeed an enviable turning point. But Tianyong wasn't one to stay content. Instead of diligently fulfilling his duties as a police officer, he lived recklessly and without discipline, even missing work without reason. Most importantly, throughout his years of service, he became notorious for his inability to get along with colleagues, always looking to cause trouble and ready to fight over the smallest issues. Gradually, no one wanted to work with him. Colleagues avoided him like a bomb that could explode at any moment. The situation became so tense that during a personnel transfer, the leadership tried to reassign him to prison duty, a move they thought clever to rid themselves of this time bomb. But for Tianyong, being transferred from a railway police officer to working in a prison environment was unacceptable. In his eyes, this was nothing short of punishment, from being a person of authority to someone who had to face inmates all day. Feeling humiliated and coerced, in his anger, he had a fierce confrontation with the unit leadership. This confrontation led to a tragic outcome. He was fired without mercy. In just one day, he went from being a police officer to unemployed. Bitterness grew increasingly in Tianyong's heart. After more than a decade serving in law enforcement, he was left with nothing but bitterness. No fame, no fortune, no status. Worse still, with limited education and no specialized skills, finding new employment seemed impossible. In the years that followed, he lived an aimless life, wandering the streets, filled with hatred for society. Perhaps it was during these dark days that the seeds of crime began to germinate in Tianyong's twisted mind. By 1996, he encountered his old friend Xiao Lin. Lin was born in 1960, 2 years younger than Tianyong. His hometown was in Jiamusi City, Heilongjiang Province. When he was young, he followed his parents to Yunnan, attending elementary and middle school there. Later, he returned to his hometown with his parents. Like Tianyong, Lin had also served in the military, but unlike his friend who had been a police officer, he had early on fallen into a life of crime, living dishonestly through various petty thefts. Before meeting Tianyong again, Lin had just pulled off a bold fraud scheme in northeast China in 1995, stealing 1 million yuan, about $120,000. Lucky for him, due to lack of decisive evidence, he escaped being placed on the wanted list. However, Lin understood that with such a large sum of money, sooner or later the police would find leads. Therefore, he decided to return to Yunnan, where he had spent his childhood, to hide and avoid attention. In Kunming, the meeting between Tianyong and Lin seemed like a cruel joke of fate. Before Tianyong's eyes, his old friend Lin now lived a life of luxury, spending money lavishly. This sight only intensified the bitterness in Tianyong's heart, and his envious gaze couldn't hide his jealousy of his old friend's lifestyle. Because he understood Tianyong's character so well, when he heard his old friend had been forced to leave the police force, Lin wasn't surprised at all. Like a carefully calculated move, Lin began sharing details of his fraud scheme, dropping pieces of information like bait to test the former police officer's reaction. It was a risky gamble. Lin knew well he was taking a chance. After all, Tianyong had been a police officer for many years, and one word of denunciation from him could make everything collapse. But as Lin thought, Tianyong not only didn't object but showed particular interest. Through Tianyong's hungry gaze, Lin realized that he desperately needed money, and more importantly, was willing to do anything to get it. After that, during each meeting, Tianyong and Lin would eagerly discuss plans for quick wealth. They heard rumors about people who had built fortunes through smuggling and other illegal activities, but both understood this wasn't simple. In other words, they needed resources and guidance. This was the weakness of both men. Though Tianyong was a former police officer, he had never had connections to the criminal underworld, and Lin had just arrived in Kunming where everything was still unfamiliar. With just two people, executing major operations seemed impossible. In early 1997, Tianyong and Lin decided to form a gang. They understood that the success of their plan depended on choosing absolutely loyal and trustworthy members. The first person Lin thought of was his own younger brother, Xiao Li. Though only 25 and holding a stable job at a pesticide factory in his hometown, Li always absolutely trusted and obeyed his older brother. As soon as Lin had established himself in Kunming, he convinced his younger brother to quit his job and join them. Besides his brother, Lin specially called his longtime friend Chai Guoli from Jimusi, Heilongjiang. There was also someone named Teng Diandong, a fellow countryman Lin had met when he first returned to Kunming and was hospitalized. At that time, Diandong couldn't even afford his hospital bills, but it was clear he valued loyalty and knew how to repay kindness. So Lin helped Diandong pay his hospital bills. And indeed, Lin had an excellent eye for character. After leaving the hospital, the two became sworn brothers, and Diandong naturally became a link in Tianyong and Lin's gang. He also called another trusted countryman, Zuo Shuguang. Tianyong brought in his cousin Yang Mingchai from his hometown in Chuxiang. Thus, the 7-member gang was officially formed. Except for Tianyong and Mingchai, who were from Yunnan, the other 5 were all from northeast China. With the team assembled, what would they do? After discussion, they decided to target car theft. The automotive market was quite active then, with good cars being particularly scarce and hard to buy. They figured stealing cars and reselling them would surely be profitable. With his experience as a former police officer, Tianyong had deeper calculations than his accomplices. He understood that in the criminal world, no witnesses could be left behind. To avoid detection, they had to act ruthlessly and decisively, which meant being ready to kill to silence witnesses. April 6, 1997, marked a fateful day that began their bloody crime spree. Their first target was chosen within Kunming City. That afternoon, Lin took Diandong and Guoli to the Chunyuan residential area. Before leaving, Tianyong had equipped Lin with 2 grenades and a dagger. The grenades he had stolen when leaving the military, never imagining they would be used years later. After a while, they spotted an expensive-looking Jeep. In the back seat, a man was busy arranging items, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Lin and Guoli quickly approached, opened the car door, and got into the back seat. Before the victim could react, Lin immediately struck him with the grenade, rendering him unconscious. Then, Guoli and Diandong coordinated their attack, repeatedly stabbing the car owner with the dagger. Thinking the victim was dead, Lin's group decided to drive to the city stadium parking lot to plan their next move. But on the way, the car owner suddenly sat up. In that terrifying moment, they realized the victim was still alive. Panicked and frightened, Guoli and Diandong immediately drew their knives, frantically stabbing the victim repeatedly until he lay completely motionless in his seat. The atmosphere in the car became suffocating, with the heavy smell of blood mixed with sweat. An eerie silence fell over them, no one daring to speak, each lost in their own thoughts about the crime they had just committed. When they reached the parking lot, Lin stopped the car, and following Tianyong's careful instructions, the group began eliminating evidence. They meticulously wiped every surface that could leave fingerprints, from seats to door handles, and collected all items that could lead to clues. Before leaving, they discovered 20,000 yuan, about $2,400, in cash in a travel bag on the back seat. This was quite a prize. When the group reconvened, Tianyong noticed something unsettling in his accomplice's eyes and attitudes. As the most experienced member, he understood that the first kill had left significant psychological trauma on these novice criminals. With a leader's instinct, Tianyong decided to let the group take the stolen money to Dali to spend and relieve their stress. Tianyong's decision achieved its desired effect. After the trip and spending all the stolen money, the young criminals seemed reborn. Their fear and guilt about killing were gradually replaced by excitement about how easily they had acquired money. While his accomplices were absorbed in their pleasures, Tianyong had already begun planning their next crimes. "We need to get guns," Tianyong told Lin during one meeting. Lin pondered deeply, as acquiring a gun wouldn't be simple. Perhaps they would have to steal one from the police. This idea seemed too risky and dangerous. After asking around, Lin learned that many state-owned factory security departments were equipped with guns at that time. He began calculating in his head. He went to Chuxiong, about 100 kilometers from Kunming, stalked around a factory for several days, and finally identified a target. It was someone named Zhou Guoxiang, deputy chief of security, who regularly carried a Type 54 pistol. Lin returned to Kunming and discussed the gun-stealing plan with Tianyong. At this point, Tianyong came up with a strategy. He wanted his accomplices to pose as police officers to make Guoqiang fall into their trap. On the evening of June 23, 1997, the group spotted a jeep with Guizhou plates at a Kunming hospital. They chose the right moment to steal the car and immediately replaced it with prepared local plates. This is also why, even though the car owner reported it immediately, the police couldn't find any leads. To ensure the gun robbery in Lufeng would be absolutely successful, Tianyong spent over 10 days preparing everyone. He found several police uniforms for everyone to wear. As a former police officer, Tianyong even trained them in how to talk and walk like police officers, including proper formal salutes. On July 10th, the group drove their stolen jeep to Lufeng City, following security chief Guoxiang. Waiting until the area was deserted, their car accelerated and stopped in front of Guoqiang. Lin, sitting in the passenger seat, lowered the window and said to Guoqiang outside, "Hello, comrade. Someone from our unit has fled with public funds. We've investigated and found that his girlfriend lives nearby. Could you help us by coming to the police station to provide more information?" Guoqiang stood there, his eyes scanning over the car before settling on Lin. At that moment, the back window slowly lowered, revealing Tianyong and Guoli sitting in the back seat. When Guoqiang saw Tianyong wearing a major's uniform, he immediately felt respect. Without any suspicion, he got into their car to show them the way. Lin, with fake friendliness, pulled out a cigarette to offer Guoqiang. In the moment when the victim was completely relaxed, Guoli used a dagger from behind to stab him in the chest. Guoqiang's first reaction was to reach for his gun, but it was too late. Lin in the front seat immediately turned and stabbed him as well. The two coordinated, one from front and one from behind, stabbing dozens of times until the victim stopped breathing. Tianyong, wearing gloves, took the Type 54 pistol from Guoqiang's belt, along with a magazine and 13 bullets. At this moment, Tianyong felt extremely excited because he was very familiar with this Type 54 pistol. Whether during his time in the military or later at the Railway Bureau, he had used this type of gun. He knew its power well, and this gun would later become these criminals' most important tool for their crimes. That night, they drove out of the city and stopped at a hillside on National Highway 320, pushing Guoqiang's body down the slope. 5 days later, a farmer accidentally discovered it and reported to the police. When police arrived at the scene, they identified the victim as Zhou Guoqiang, who had been stabbed 24 times. The dagger used in the crime was found near the body, but no fingerprints could be collected. The only thing that could be determined from the wounds was that there were 2 to 3 perpetrators. But that was all the police could gather. In an era without surveillance cameras and networked systems, the investigation faced countless difficulties. No witnesses, no electronic traces, no other clues. The case hit a dead end. The limitations of technology and investigative tools had inadvertently created a void for criminals to operate freely. From then on, Tianyong and his accomplices grew increasingly bold. This successful operation had brought great confidence to Tianyong's gang. Moreover, they discovered that impersonating military personnel wasn't just a tool to easily approach victims, it also gave them a special sense of power. In the role of law enforcement officers, they could order, threaten, and control their victims. From here, they embarked on a frenzied path of car theft, murder, and robbery. To look more like police officers, they even managed to obtain handcuffs and forged documents. They became increasingly addicted to these roles. Once, Tianyong and his accomplices went to Kunming's famous auto parts street. Since their main income came from selling stolen cars, they wanted to check if there were any opportunities. While wandering around, their eyes suddenly lit up when they saw an orange Mitsubishi Pajero parked there. This Japanese model was very popular, and in the 90s, imported cars were rare and extremely expensive. At that time, Lin stepped forward, waving a fake ID in front of the driver's face and said, "We're police officers. Someone has reported that your car is from an illegal source. Please come with us to assist with the investigation." Before the driver could explain, Lin had already handcuffed him and pushed him into the car. Afterward, they drove to a secluded location, and Lin called Tianyong to come. Tianyong professionally pretended to take the driver's statement. Through conversation, they learned that this person was named Dao Guoqing, a driver for government officials. He was driving around because his leader was in a meeting. The reason Tianyong took his statement was to investigate the victim's financial situation. If he was very wealthy, they might be able to extort more. However, Guoqing gradually realized something was wrong with the people in the car. When he tried to struggle and escape from the car, Tianyong and Mingchai immediately grabbed his arms and legs from both ends, while Guoli strangled him. Within minutes, the victim had stopped breathing. Finally, they threw his body into a dry well. Afterward, Tianyong arranged for 2 people to drive the stolen car straight to Shenyang to sell. The car ended up selling for 190,000 yuan, about $23,000. Having a lot of money was certainly good, but money often brings trouble. Tianyong was naturally very careful. He thought that with 7 members in the group, each could develop their own ambitions and desires, which could lead to the organization's collapse. As a former police officer, Tianyong understood that controlling internal affairs was just as important as dealing with external threats. Everyone in the group called Tianyong political commissar and called Lin commander. These two were the core figures of the gang. Tianyong had set many rules, such as how to divide the money. He also made each member write down detailed family circumstances, relatives lists, and locked them in a safe. This was actually to prevent anyone from betraying their brothers. After all, no one would dare risk their relatives' lives. Therefore, Tianyong not only had a sense of counter-investigation against outsiders, but also kept a tight grip on the gang members. His behavior became increasingly arrogant and reckless. Very soon after, they committed a major crime that shocked the entire country. One day in April 1998, Tianyong heard people say that recently in the evenings, near the cable car station at Western Mountain tourist area in Kunming, there were often small cars parked. Inside the cars were couples taking advantage of the darkness for dating, and one thing was certain, people who could drive there weren't poor. Tianyong thought that their group could continue using their police impersonation scheme for extortion. Around 8 p.m. that evening, Tianyong brought his tools and handcuffs, along with several accomplices, to the predetermined location. They walked around for a while and discovered a blue Changhe van. There were no other cars around, making it very convenient for them to act. When they approached and looked inside, they saw a man and woman embracing in the back seat. Tianyong knocked on the car window. When the window lowered, the 2 people inside looked surprised. Tianyong, as usual, presented his fake narcotics police ID, saying he suspected them of using drugs. The couple in the car immediately tried to explain. Unexpectedly, these fake police met real police. It turned out this couple were also police officers. The woman was named Wang Xiaoxiang, an employee of the information department of the Kunming City Police Bureau, and the man was Wang Junbo, deputy chief of the Lunan County Police Bureau. When hearing this, Tianyong wasn't frightened at all, but instead turned to Mingkai and Diandong, who were behind him, and said, handcuff them. The couple in the car were confused, not understanding what was happening. No matter how Xiaoxiang and Junbo tried to explain, Tianyong had no intention of stopping. Xiaoxiang took out her phone, but before she could dial, Tianyong snatched it away. Junbo then shouted loudly and tried to struggle, his handcuffed hand moving toward his waist. Seeing this, Tianyong quickly intervened, repeatedly slapping Junbo's face hard until he was nearly unconscious. Tianyong knew for sure Junbo had a gun at his waist. Indeed, it was a Type 77. This Type 77 pistol, compared to his Type 54, was more compact and lighter, with the main feature being that it could be loaded with one hand. He picked up the gun and immediately shot Junbo in the heart. Then 2 more bang-bang sounds rang out, and 2 more victims lost their lives. Killing 2 police officers wasn't a small matter. Tianyong knew they had to quickly dispose of the 2 bodies, or there would be trouble. This was a government vehicle, too conspicuous for them to drive away. Therefore, they took all belongings from the victims, tried to erase as many traces as possible from the car, and then parked both the bodies and car in front of a nearby company's gate. After finishing this, Tianyong wasn't feeling very comfortable because, after all, he had taken a gun from a deputy police chief. Sure enough, the case of 2 murdered police officers not only shocked the local area, but quickly spread across the entire country. Who would dare to be so bold as to kill police officers? The police naturally had to investigate thoroughly. Tianyong's group decided to temporarily lay low and look for a chance to escape. But before they could run, he received news. Not only had the police not found them, but they had quickly identified a suspect named Du Peiwu. Even Tianyong wondered who Peiwu was. It turned out Peiwu was the husband of the female officer Xiaoxiang, and also a police officer working at the Kunming Drug Rehabilitation Center, who suddenly became the prime suspect in the murder of his wife. The police seemed to have rushed to build a theory about the motive. An enraged husband who discovered his wife's affair had taken revenge brutally. However, Peiwu insisted he had an alibi. On the night of the murders, he was working at the rehabilitation center, and there were even witnesses. But the police didn't believe him, and stubbornly clung to one point. Normally, ordinary people couldn't easily make a deputy police chief surrender his gun. But if the perpetrator at the scene was Peiwu, this situation could occur. Finally, although they never found the most important piece of evidence, the missing gun, in February 1999, Peiwu was convicted of intentional homicide and sentenced to death. He appealed, and his sentence was reduced to death with reprieve, barely saving his life. It wasn't until Tianyong's criminal gang was caught that Peiwu was finally exonerated. The Peiwu case became one of the largest wrongful conviction cases in Chinese criminal justice history. Later investigation revealed that he had been severely tortured to obtain a confession. If he had actually been executed then, it would have truly been a grave injustice. After the shocking case of the 2 murdered police officers, Tianyong's psychology changed. First, he felt unhappy because he had initially thought he could use the stolen Type 77 pistol later, but then he realized this gun was an important link in the case. Once its use was discovered, their crimes could be exposed. Therefore, this gun could only be locked in the safe. The group's motives for action were no longer simply theft and robbery. They had completely transformed into demons, killing innocent people indiscriminately. Once, Mingtai and Tianyong were walking down the street when they saw a beautiful girl, dragged her into their car, raped her, then killed her to silence her, afterward throwing her body into a drainage ditch. The gang leader Tianyong wasn't unconcerned about his brothers doing this, but he worried that carelessly disposing of bodies like this would eventually lead to mistakes. If police found some evidence on them, everything would be over. At that time, Tianyong was moving house. To deceive people, he rented 2 farms for livestock in the east and west areas. He stayed in the east, while Lin stayed in the west. The farms outwardly raised dozens of pigs and wolves, but in reality, they had become their base for future crimes, because Tianyong had thought of a way to dispose of bodies that he was sure no one could ever discover. By March 1999, Tianyong's group was looking for targets on the road when they spotted a black Nissan Gloria. They waited until dark to execute their plan. At this time, a man and woman were getting into the car. Tianyong used their usual method, knocking on the window with his police identity, then successfully brought both people and car to the East Farm. Afterward, they killed these two victims, then assigned people to drive the car to Shenyang to sell. Along the way, they planned to dispose of the two victims' bodies, but Tianyong suddenly proposed a brutal idea. "Why don't we feed them to the pigs and dogs?" Hearing this, the others looked at each other in doubt. Although each of them already had blood on their hands, no one dared to step forward to do this. Therefore, Tianyong had to do it himself, but he required everyone to stand beside him and watch him complete this task. After dismembering the victims, he put the bones and flesh into a large pot to cook, then poured it into the animals' feeding troughs. Lin's younger brother Xiao Li, the youngest in the group, after witnessing the entire process, vomited on the spot and developed a high fever. Tianyong said he wanted everyone to get used to these scenes to become more daring. Their group had transformed into Satan-like demons, continuing to carry out savage massacres afterward. Subsequently, 10 more people were brutally murdered, all disposed of in the same way. These innocent lives vanished from the earth as if they had evaporated and naturally left no clues behind. Tianyong had trained 6 butchers who had lost their humanity, and they believed that each of their crimes was perfect, with flawless coordination. So could they escape the law forever? After 2000, Tianyong and his accomplices' methods escalated once again. They directly impersonated traffic police, setting up checkpoints on the road. Ordinary people usually didn't dare doubt police identity, especially in broad daylight. Their uniforms and way of speaking never made people think they were fake police. On the evening of April 23rd, the group stopped a Mitsubishi car by the road. The person sitting in the car looked like a wealthy businessman, wearing gold rings, gold necklaces, and expensive watches. Tianyong didn't say much, directly killing the man. This operation again earned them a large sum of money. Everything seemed perfect, but there was an unexpected secret slip-up. When searching the wealthy man's body, Guoli found a very thin and compact mobile phone. He secretly kept it without anyone knowing. When he got home, he discovered it was the newest Motorola Phi 998 flip phone, which had just been released and cost over 10,000 yuan, about $1,200. Guoli was short on money at the time, and he had a girlfriend who suggested selling the phone for cash. Guoli cautiously waited 2 months before taking the phone to a pawn shop. The shop owner asked him to turn on the phone to check if it worked well. After turning it on, the pawn shop owner made a test call. This action led to the complete exposure of Tianyong's group. After the wealthy man's disappearance case was filed for investigation, police had begun tracking the signal from this phone. When the phone was turned on, its location was quickly discovered. Chai Guoli was caught on the spot. At the police station, he initially tried to lie and make excuses, but experienced police officers recognized that he had a weak will, so they applied rotating interrogation tactics. After nearly a week of continuous questioning without rest, Guoli couldn't take it anymore and decided to voluntarily confess, hoping to gain a chance for a reduced sentence. Thus, police heard from Guoli's own mouth about all the crimes they had committed from 1997 to May 2000. During the confession, the criminal investigators had to take deep breaths, their scalps going numb. A series of disappearances in Kunming over many years was finally solved. Particularly, the high-profile case of 2 murdered police officers took an unexpected turn. Du Peiwu, who had been sentenced to death with reprieve, was soon freed as innocent, causing a public sensation. And the criminal gang led by Tianyong was finally not far from facing legal punishment. Police initially thought catching a cunning Tianyong with strong anti-investigation awareness would surely be a difficult challenge. But unexpectedly, the entire arrest process was very smooth. Police took less than a week to capture the remaining 6 gang members. On the day they arrested Tianyong, knowing he had 2 guns, police mobilized over 100 officers. But in the end, Tianyong didn't resist at all. Long ago, he had told his brothers that once caught, resistance was useless, just keeping one's life was enough. And he truly did just that. On October 25, 2000, the Kunming Intermediate People's Court conducted the first trial of Tianyong's murder and robbery case. All 7 gang members, including Yang Tianyong, were sentenced to death. When the verdict was announced, sobbing sounds erupted from the public gallery. These were the relatives of the 19 innocent victims. On the morning of November 17, 2000, the Kunming Intermediate People's Court announced at the city stadium that the 7 criminals from Yang Tianyong's murder and robbery gang would be taken to the execution ground to carry out their sentences. With this, the most violent criminal gang in Yunnan since its establishment was finally eliminated. And that was today's case. What are your thoughts about this case? Please share in the comments section below. Thank you for watching and see you in our next videos.